At 700 hours on a bitter January morning in 1945, the world felt like it was made of iron and ice. In the frozen command post of the 7th Infantry Regiment, a man named Garland Merle Connor stood watching the tree line 400 yards away. He was only 25 years old, but his face told the story of a lifetime spent in the shadows of giants. He was a small man, standing just 5'6" and weighing barely 120 pounds. Back home in Clinton County, Kentucky, he was a tobacco farmer who had never even finished high school. The nearest school was 15 miles away, a distance too far for a boy needed on the family farm. He was the kind of man you might walk past on a city street without a second glance. But the German 19th Army was about to learn that size has nothing to do with the strength of a man's soul. Massed in the woods before him were 600 elite infantry troops and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks. These were 60-ton monsters, steel predators designed to crush anything in their path. Their mission was simple: break the American line at Husson, France, and turn the tide of the war. Connor had been in the Army since March 1941. In 4 years of constant warfare, he had survived 10 major campaigns and 4 amphibious assault landings. He had been wounded 7 times. In fact, he had only returned from the hospital 2 days earlier. His wounds weren't even fully healed, but he couldn't stay away from his men. The ground they held was part of the Colmar Pocket, a brutal 850 square mile stretch of frozen forest and farm fields. The Germans were desperate, trapped with their backs to the Rhine River. Every previous attempt to clear this pocket had ended in tragedy. The French First Army had already lost thousands of men trying to push through this frozen hell. The conditions were beyond human endurance. Temperatures averaged 10 degrees below zero. There was no moonlight to guide them, only the ghostly reflection of the snow. For 18 days, the battalion had lived in frozen foxholes, losing men every single night to snipers and sudden artillery strikes. Connor was an intelligence officer, a role that usually kept a man behind the lines, working with maps and prisoners. But Garland Connor wasn't a man who stayed behind. He had already earned 4 Silver Stars for direct combat action. He had a reputation in the 3rd Battalion. When things turned desperate, Connor moved toward the sound of the guns. And at 07:15 that morning, the situation became more than desperate. It became a nightmare. The German artillery began to walk across the American positions. Trees didn't just fall. They exploded into lethal splinters. The earth fountained into the air, frozen chunks of soil hitting the ground like shrapnel. For 12 minutes, the world was nothing but fire and noise. And then, a terrifying silence, followed by the low, rhythmic rumble of heavy engines. A runner burst into the command post, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air. The Tigers were coming. Hundreds of infantry were moving through the woods toward the battalion's left flank. The commander looked at the map in silence. They had no tanks. They had no tank destroyers. They had nothing but the men in the foxholes. The only thing that could stop a Tiger tank was a direct hit from heavy artillery. But to get that fire, they needed someone who could see the targets. The forward observation post had been obliterated by the opening barrage. The observers were gone. From the command post, the thick trees blocked every view of the advancing enemy. Connor didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for an order because he knew the order would be a death sentence. He grabbed a telephone and a 400-yard spool of wire. He looked at his commander for a brief second, then stepped out of the warmth and into the white void of the snow. He began to run. 400 yards of open ground lay between him and the front line. It was a flat, featureless expanse where he was the only moving target. As the wire unspooled behind him, The German guns opened up again. They saw the lone figure. They saw the man trying to save his friends, and they tried to erase him. The first shells landed 40 yards away, then 30. They were adjusting their fire, zeroing in on the small man in the snow. A shell hit a tree directly in his path, splitting the massive trunk. Connor didn't slow down. He vaulted over the burning wood and kept moving. The concussion waves hit him like physical blows, hammering his eardrums until all he heard was a high-pitched ringing. He reached the front-line foxholes, where soldiers crouched in terror. They watched in disbelief as their intelligence officer, a man who belonged in a tent with a map, ran past them and into no man's land. He found a shallow ditch 30 yards ahead of the American line. It was barely 18 inches deep, not enough to hide a man, but enough to give him a view. He dropped into the frozen mud and cranked the telephone. The connection held. 3 miles behind him, 12 105mm howitzers were waiting for his word. Connor was now the eyes of the battalion. He raised his head and saw the German infantry just 200 yards away, moving in professional lethal squads. Behind the infantry were the Tigers, massive 60-ton monsters that pushed over trees like they were toothpicks. Connor could see their markings, the Balkan cross on the turrets. He knew if he failed, the men behind him would be slaughtered. He gave the coordinates. Fire mission, enemy infantry in the open, adjusting. He counted the seconds as the sky began to scream. The first shells landed too far back. "Drop 100!" he shouted into the handset. "Fire for effect!" The next salvo was a masterpiece of destruction. The forest erupted as 168 pounds of high explosives detonated simultaneously in the middle of the German formation. The German advance staggered. The infantry scattered, diving for cover that wasn't there. But the Tigers were unaffected. They drove right through the smoke, their 88mm guns cracking like thunder. They were systematic, picking off American foxholes one by one. Connor knew he had to bring the fire closer. "Drop 50! Fire for effect!" he commanded. The shells began to rain around the tanks. One Tiger took a hit to its track and spun in a circle, immobilized but still firing. Another began to smoke, but 4 of them were still coming, and they had spotted Connor's position. They saw the wire. They knew who was calling the lightning. The tanks turned their turrets toward his shallow ditch. At 150 yards, he could see the faces of the German commanders. He realized that the only way to stop them was to do the unthinkable. He took a deep breath of the freezing air and spoke the words that usually meant the end. "Fire on my position." The officer on the other end of the line paused. He asked Connor to confirm. "Calling artillery on your own head was a suicide move." Connor confirmed a second time, then a third. 40 seconds later, the world ended. The first shells hit just 30 yards from his ditch. The pressure wave compressed his lungs, and the heat scorched his face. He stayed in the ditch, his fingers frozen to the handset. "Drop 20. Repeat fire." Now the shells were landing within 20 yards. Shrapnel tore through the air inches above his head. He was at the center of a storm of steel. The Tigers stopped. Even a tank crew couldn't handle the intensity of a point-blank American barrage. The German infantry tried to rally, using the tanks as shields. They were crawling through the snow, trying to flank him. Connor could hear their voices now. He could hear the metallic click of their rifles. He dropped the fire even closer. The explosions were so near that dirt cascaded into his ditch, burying him alive. Something hit his shoulder, shrapnel or a rock, and his arm went numb. He switched the phone to his other hand and kept talking. For 3 hours, this went on. A lone lieutenant in a ditch, fighting a private war against 600 men and 6 tanks. He was being hunted by 2 different armies' artillery, and he refused to move. One by one, the Tigers were neutralized. One lost its vision ports, another had its turret jammed. The crews began to abandon their steel fortresses, realizing they were being targeted with impossible precision. The German infantry, seeing their armor fail and their officers falling, began to lose their will. By the time the sun rose higher in the sky, the German counterattack had broken. The survivors were retreating, dragging their wounded through the blood-stained snow. Connor stayed in the ditch for another 20 minutes, making sure the silence was real. When he finally tried to stand, his body refused to move. He had been lying in frozen mud for 3 hours. He eventually crawled back to the American lines, supported by a wounded private who had joined him in the final hour. The soldiers in the foxholes watched him pass in a state of shock. The ground behind him looked like the surface of the moon, nothing but overlapping craters and the ruins of the German army. Because of Garland Connor, the American line held. Because of his courage, hundreds of mothers wouldn't receive a telegram that week. He had single-handedly stopped a breakthrough that could have changed the course of the campaign in Alsace. And yet, when he reached the command post, he simply asked for a medic to look at his shoulder. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross on the spot. General Alexander Patch came specifically to see the man who had called fire on his own head. The battalion commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. Before the paperwork could be finished, Connor was sent home. He had done enough. He returned to the rolling hills of Kentucky and did something perhaps even more remarkable than his heroism. He went back to being a farmer. He married a woman named Pauline, and they built a life on a farm with no running water or electricity. He worked the land with mules, growing tobacco and corn, just like he had before the world went mad. He never talked about the war. The 4 silver stars, the Bronze Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross were placed in a cardboard box and hidden in a duffel bag in the back of a closet. When neighbors asked about his service, he would simply say he had done what needed to be done. He never felt like a hero. He felt like a survivor. For over 50 years, his story remained a secret. It wasn't until 1996, when a researcher began asking questions about the men of the 3rd Battalion, that the truth started to come out. When the researcher saw the medals in the closet, he was stunned. He told Pauline that her husband was one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. The fight for his Medal of Honor began after he passed away in 1998. It took 22 years of legal battles, eyewitness testimonies, and a widow's unwavering love to get the Army to recognize what happened in that ditch in 1945. In 2018, 7 decades after the battle, the Medal of Honor was finally presented to Pauline. Garland Merle Connor was a man who didn't look like a legend. He didn't act like a hero. He was a quiet farmer who stood tall when the world fell apart. His story reminds us that true greatness doesn't seek the spotlight. It waits in the silence of a job well done. If you believe that the names of men like Garland Connor should never be forgotten, please take a moment to engage with this story. Your likes and shares are the only way we can ensure these heroes receive the recognition they earned in the frozen fields of France. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Whether you are in the United States, the UK, or anywhere else in the world, we want to hear from you. Sharing these stories is how we keep the spirit of these brave men alive for the next generation. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and thank you for helping us honor the legacy of Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor, a true American hero who proved that one man, with enough courage and a telephone wire, can change history.